Welcome to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton. He's locked, loaded, and ready to fire. Lawton Online starts right now.
Welcome back to Lawton Online here on the Rebel.media, folks. My name's Andrew Lawton. So great to have you tuned in today. You have, I hope by now, heard the big news that in Alberta, the government has decided that it has the right to decide who is a journalist and, more importantly, who is allowed to report on what the government is doing. Now, before I proceed with this, I want to tell you something from more of a functional programming note here. You're going to hear very shortly an interview with the Rebel's own Sheila Gunn-Reid. Not only is she the Alberta chief for the Rebel, but also she is the woman at ground zero of this battle, one of the two women with the Rebel who was banned from covering an event put on by the Notley government. Now, the interview with Sheila, because this is a podcast, we sometimes have to piecemeal things together, was recorded before the latest development in this case happened, which is that the government was no longer going to exclude people from its events, including, we're led to believe, Rebel reporters, personalities, etc. Now, this is pending the government's media review, a process that for some reason takes several weeks when I don't know why they can't just take the Alberta Press Gallery's approach, which is to say, if you say you're media, you're media. So some of the things that Sheila may say will be dated, but the reason I'm playing the whole interview as is because there's still a big discussion that needs to be had here. In the interim, yes, Rebel reporters are allowed to work, to do their jobs. The broader question here, why does an NDP government feel it has the right in the first place to decide who can and can't report? That's a question that still remains even with that very government's recanting of its policy. This is an absolutely chilling decision that was made by faceless bureaucrats in the office of Premier Notley, but then doubled down upon, by the way, this week by Notley's Director of Communications. The background of this is that Rebel's Alberta Bureau wanted to cover a number of events that were being put on by the government in Alberta, like, for example, the Royalty Review lockup, obviously a big event in Alberta politics. Also, an event between Premier Notley and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. These are things that anyone would be interested in covering, any Albertan would be interested in seeing, and certainly any journalist would be interested in covering, but that was not what Premier Notley's team had decided was allowed. Now, I want to make something very clear here before we go on, and I'm going to make this known afterwards. I am a journalist in the sense that I am involved in investigating, interviewing, reporting on things, etc., but I'm not a reporter. I don't make any claim of objectivity. I don't make any claim of impartiality. I don't claim to be unbiased. I claim to be fair and respectful. And this is true of anyone that I've ever met with the Rebel. There's going to be bias there, obviously. This is what the Rebel is. It's an answer to the mainstream media narrative. We can't let the mainstream media claim it's not biased in a lot of ways, just simply in the other direction. But there's always a pursuit of the truth there. So that the government has not only decided to disallow people who share a different viewpoint, but more importantly, has decided to target and say you are not allowed to cover this is absolutely chilling and illegal. To talk a little bit more about this and share the backstory to this, I'm very pleased to welcome Rebel Alberta Bureau Chief Sheila Gunn-Reid to the show. Sheila, great to have you on the show. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, I should say, you may not be a real journalist in the eyes of the NDP, but yes, you have a spot on this show, so thank you.
Well, but I got you banned, so don't be such a big fan.
Well, it's funny you mention that because I've spoken to you not only on this podcast now, but I also guest host on a radio station in Calgary, and I also host this show on The Rebel. Now, I wondered about that. If I ever am guest hosting again and I want to interview someone from the government, does my identification with The Rebel supersede in the government's eyes my identity as a radio host? I don't know the answer to that question, so who knows? I might not be able to cover anything in the future either.
Well, I think their legal letter made it pretty clear. The two lines from the government we got in response was that anybody who works for the Rebel, anybody who is affiliated with the Rebel or will become affiliated with the Rebel is not a journalist. So I guess you're out of luck, Andrew.
Wow. You know what? I'm probably saving myself a headache there. Let's
No
talk
kidding.
about what was that letter responding to? Because I saw the letter go out, and you're right. It was 2 sentences, and it was this letter that instantly just sent a chill down my bone because I'm not even thinking of the implication of people like you trying to do your job. I'm thinking of like the grand constitutional stuff here. But you have a job to do, and this 2-sentence letter denied your right to do it.
Yes. I mean, and it was all response to, we had sent a letter to the government detailing what had transpired over the course of, a week or so, and how we thought the government was infringing on our constitutional rights to a free press and free expression. And that was their totalitarian reply to us.
Wow. What's the catalyst for this? Because I know there were some videos on the Rebel. There was the one that really went viral, and I didn't realize this had now happened 3 times where Rebel reporters were stonewalled by this government.
That's exactly it. It was towards the end of January. It was when the Alberta Royalty Review came out, and we had we have a Calgary freelancer, Holly Nicholas. She was in the technical briefing held by the government for journalists to get information so that they could write their stories about the royalty review. And I was waiting outside. She had been in there, for 90 minutes. She came in, she checked in with her Rebel ID and her government ID, and she was accepted into the media lockup. I showed up there 90 minutes later at 10:30 for the 11 o'clock press conference afterwards, and I was recognized. And so somebody went into the technical briefing and removed Holly because she's with the Rebel, and then informed the both of us that we would not be allowed to participate in the press conference at all. And then subsequent to that, we were actually removed from the entire floor of the hotel where this was taking place so that we missed the media scrums, and we missed the stakeholder interviews that we had lined up post-press conference.
So you had already done the work. You had already gotten ready to do something. You had stuff lined up, and you were no-shows because they wouldn't let you in the room.
Right, and we had somebody in the technical briefing that they actually physically removed from the room after 90 minutes. And then later on in the week, on February 3rd, Justin Trudeau and Rachel Notley held a joint press conference at the legislature. To avoid any further confusion, we actually at the Rebel checked in with the president of the legislature press gallery, Darcy Henton, and he informed us that any working media can participate in press conferences at the legislature, and we only need our valid press credentials from the Rebel to be able to participate in any press conferences there. So I showed up. I checked in at security the way I have before any other time that I've covered events at the legislature, and they informed me I was on a no-go list. So I turned my camera on and waited for someone to give me an explanation, and I was ejected from the legislature. I wasn't even given an excuse. I wasn't even given the opportunity to ask why I was being ejected. I was just removed from the property.
And I saw that raw video in question. A man comes up to you, walks out, says, "You got to go," walks back in. You're asking him a question. He's walking away, not even answering. Do we know who he was?
I suspect he's the head of security for the legislature. So he's just somebody doing his job.
So he asks you if you're accredited. You say that you've already spoken to the head of the press gallery for the Alberta legislature. Contrary to popular belief, there's no secret handshake for being a journalist. Anyone is able to in Canada. That's the point of being in a free country.
Exactly. And actually, I was showing him what you can't hear, but you can't see, but you can sort of hear. I'm pulling out my Rebel press ID that we all have that identifies us as working journalists for the Rebel. And as soon as I told him that we had spoke to Darcy Henton, that's when it was time for me to go.
Wow. So let's take a step back here then. This has happened. By the time the event with Notley and Trudeau happened, you're already expecting, okay, they're not going to give us an easy ride of this. But did you ever just imagine that you were going to be given in writing a line from the government that said, you know what, we just don't value you as a news organization. That's basically what they're saying. We don't accept that you are one, because it's funny. I mean, this is the type of thing that you'd only ever hear about as like, okay, someone told you something, you make a video talking about it. They actually gave it in writing with their lawyer. A director of communications for the government has doubled down on this. They're standing by it. But even the mainstream media elites are turning on them for this, recognizing how dangerous a precedent this is.
Well, and that's really been the interesting part for me. These people in the mainstream media who that we at the Rebel are so often critical of, they're standing with us because I think we all realize what a dangerous precedent this sets. If we give this government the right to determine who a journalist is, who knows what the next government will do and who they will blacklist.
One big question that I think comes of this is this line of what a journalist really is, because I know that there's been a lot of people that have been circulating, for example, a tweet that your colleague Holly had where she had said, you know, she's a commentator. And I know people have pulled out what Ezra himself has said in the past, but he's not a journalist in that. And people are lacking the context there of those comments in a lot of ways. I mean, not a traditional journalist is, I think, a more accurate way of putting it.
Right.
But still, someone who is pursuing truth, interviewing people, investigating stories, opinionated or not, that is under the banner of journalism, I think.
Well, and that's really the thing, Andrew. There's a changing landscape of media, and I'm really lucky that we are on the forefront and it's almost like the wild frontier right now. And there's room for all of us on the spectrum, whether you're mainstream media, far left like Rabble, or right wing like the Rebel. There's room for all of us here. And I think a more diverse, more robust media is always a good thing. When we're seeing layoffs in the mainstream media and people complaining about the amalgamation under Post Media, it's really refreshing to see them all come together to stand with the independent news networks.
And this is a really interesting point because you've talked about other agencies that exist here. Were there any other online publications that were allowed to cover these events?
There's local bloggers that are allowed in. Rabble has been allowed in. Vice has been allowed in. Huffington Post is allowed in. So people or organizations who are generally online based, they're allowed in. This is specifically about us at the Rebel, and their lawyer's letter said as much.
Obviously, the Rebel has had to respond to this and say, look, the only way to do this if they're not going to play ball and let us in the future is to go the legal route. The Constitution, all the issues that I have with it in Canada, this is not one of them. It's pretty darn clear about freedom of the press.
Well, and that's where we're going next. We are launching a legal challenge because we just want to be able to do our jobs. We have to sue the government for the opportunity to do our jobs and to make sure that they can't grant unto themselves this right to determine who's a journalist and who's not. Like you said, it does set a very, very dangerous precedent. We don't want money. We just want assurances that this won't happen to us or to anybody else for that matter.
One person asked me earlier on when I was really talking about this on social media, they're like, oh, well, would you stand up and say that, Rabble has the right to be in there if they get banned? And you mentioned them before, and I'd say absolutely I would. I mean, we're not talking about a private event on private property here. We're talking about the government, which has a necessity to be held to account by all media. If they threw you out because you were heckling, okay, that would be a different story. They didn't even give you the chance to do your job in that room.
No, and I mean, the video is there. I could not have been more polite. I think I apologized twice and they were throwing me out.
Yeah, you were, I think you were too polite, but it proves the point that this had nothing to do with you. They had already made up their minds.
Exactly. And I've said in my videos, if this has happened to Rabble, if this had happened to CBC, I'd be making noise too, because next they would come for me. Well, they came for me first.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the hypocrisy here because We heard under the last federal government, under Stephen Harper's time in office, people complaining, the left complaining, media complaining about how inhospitable his government was to the press. They said he wasn't available, he didn't do enough interviews, he didn't have enough press conferences, and that may have been true by the standards that have been laid out now. But what never happened was one outlet being plucked out for unpopular coverage based on that political bent and say, you guys can't go there. And this is exactly what's happened now. And despite the fact that most people in media are defending the rebel, a lot of voices on the left are saying, well, yeah, it's Ezra, it's the rebel, we don't want them. And people are really being shamelessly hypocritical here compared to had the shoe been on the other foot.
Well, and you know what, Andrew, I think that proves my point. That proves my point that this really is selective outrage on behalf of the government based on my personal politics, the politics of my employer. And that's not a valid reason to keep me from doing my job. They're just, these people, these online commenters, they're just actually reaffirming my position when they point out things that I've said, that I can't cover the government because I said X or Y. Well, that's not a reason why I can't.
You literally wrote the book on this government. It's been a bestseller on Amazon. You know this government. You've studied this government. When they were elected, a lot of people, myself included, were really looking at them and saying this is going to be a disaster economically. It's going to be a disaster on other counts. I never expected something like this, though, and I guess that's the surreptitious nature that these violations of people's liberties have, is that they can really come out of nowhere, but the government can behave in a tyrannical manner here, and they're proving that they have that intent in this case.
I did a brief little interview with The Blaze this morning, and it made me reflect really on American politics. We in Alberta, not we, but not me, it was really a protest vote here. And I think this is what happens when people cast a protest ballot as opposed to a smart ballot. And I hope that the people in Manitoba realize this, the people in the United States realize this. Vote smart. Don't vote for change at all costs.
You mentioned The Blaze, so this is even being picked up outside of Canada.
Yes. It is. You know what? I've seen pretty well all the major Canadian publications have picked it up, which is great. But even The Blaze is covering this now because it's just so egregious. It's so outrageous that, the government can just use a heavy hand to shut up its loudest critic.
So you've said that the rebels not seeking money here, just the right to do their job. Is there any decision that would really make it better at this point in terms of your own sort of feelings of closure on this, or has the time passed for that by now?
At the end of the day, Andrew, I just want to be able to do my job, and I just want everybody else to be able to do their job. I don't need an apology from the government, a half-hearted apology. I don't need, someone to strong-arm an apology out of the government. I just want assurances that this will not happen to me again. My job is to tell the stories of everyday Albertans, and sometimes that takes me to the steps of the legislature. It's an important job to me. It's something I'm very passionate about because I'm an everyday Albertan, and I resent the fact that I have a government that thinks it has the right to decide that I'm not a journalist enough to do that.
As much as I would love for the government to see the error of its ways here, there's a part of me that almost wants this to go the legal route, just so that there is a precedent set that protects the rights of organizations like the Rebel and of people like you and I.
Well, and it's funny. It's like the NDP have never heard of us before or something. This is to pick a fight with us about freedom. Seems like a really, really silly thing to do. We live for freedom. We fight for freedom. I work for a man who published the Danish cartoons. There's no way that we're going to back down to a fight. We're going to back down from a fight about freedom. It's just so ridiculous. It's like they had no idea who they were dealing with.
Yeah, and the one thing that anyone who's ever met Ezra and worked with Ezra knows, he does not fight quietly either. No,
he does not at all. And, this really is, at the Rebel, this is our wheelhouse. We love freedom, and we'll fight for yours, and we'll fight for ours, and we'll fight for someone on the left who wants to start a media company so that a right-wing government down the road can't throw them out of the legislature also. It's about all of us.
Very well said. Sheila Gunn-Reid joining me on the line, Alberta Bureau Chief for the Rebel, and Chief on the blacklist as well that the provincial government has for media. So you are a trendsetter one way or another, Sheila. So glad you're fighting this. So glad you're on to talk about it. We'll definitely have to keep everyone posted and have you back in the future. But truly, thank you for your time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Oh, my goodness. Just shameful. Absolutely shameful, inexcusable, and yes, tyrannical. And I don't use that word lightly. I don't use that word to cover just any case here. I use it when it fits. This is not about, like I said with Sheila, a private business that has decided it wants to take on this decision of being able to say, well, we don't want you on our property. We don't want you on your property. It's not a company that has said, I'm not going to deal with the Rebel. I would still disagree with it, but I would defend their right to do it. This is the government. The government of the day, Her Majesty's provincial government of the province of Alberta, democratically elected by the people who consume media, and now trying to deny, backing away from it, but trying to deny people the right to report. I wrote on Twitter the day this all unfolded what I saw as the glaring hypocrisy here. I wrote, this is the same government that allows children to self-identify as whatever gender they choose and be treated accordingly, use whatever washroom they want, but won't let someone identify as a journalist unless it decides they're a real journalist. This is the face of tyranny. This is the face of censorship. And it looks a lot like Rachel Notley. And this isn't something that can be rectified in terms of the true remedy needed here just by sending out a short statement that there was an error made. Wednesday, the Alberta NDP government sent out a statement saying it made a mistake. This is the statement from Cheryl Oates, the communications director, who just a day or so earlier had said, well, you know what, the Rebel is not considered a news organization. She wrote, quote, we've heard a lot of feedback from Albertans and media over the course of the last 2 days, and it's clear we made a mistake. The government has appointed former Western Canada Bureau Chief for Canadian Press, Heather Boyd, to consult and give us recommendations on what the government's media policy should be. In the meantime, no one will be excluded from government media events, unquote. Now, this comes days after the government said Rebel journalists weren't actually journalists. This comes even a day after the government said, yes, it was going to have a review, but no, Rebel reporters would not be allowed to cover events in the meantime. And I have to give them credit for at least righting the wrong. But I have to wonder why, first off, they ever thought that this was going to be something that would fly at all. And look, yes, when someone makes a mistake and someone fixes it, they have to be commended for that. But I don't think that they fixed it for the right reasons. They fixed it because they realized they had no choice. They realized that even their own were turning on them. But like I was chatting about with Sheila, as much as it has pleased me to see so many in the mainstream media lining up to support the Rebel, which is not support for the Rebel, by the way, it's supporting freedom. It's supporting free speech. As much as I've been happy to see that, there have been a number of voices from the left who have said that the Rebel doesn't have a right to be at the table. People that have focused on splitting hairs. Well, Ezra said once that he wasn't a journalist. Well, in that context. But in the broader context of covering the government, yes, it's a journalistic desire that keeps people like us doing what we do. And why does the government need a review about this? Why can't the Alberta government adopt a system similar to what the Parliamentary Press Gallery has in Ottawa, which is where the gallery gets to basically set out criteria? The Rebel would obviously meet them. That's why Brian Lilly's been in Ottawa covering a lot of parliamentary events. You've got places like Vice, Rebel, Huffington Post, etc. You don't need to have a brick-and-mortar operation to be printing on newspaper or have a CRTC license to be media now. Times have changed. The Rebel's more than a year old because it's going against that model, which has, by a lot of people's standards, been seen as quite antiquated at this point. So, what is the government expecting to get out of this so-called review? Are they just using it as cover? Are they going to come out with a new policy that they've designed to leave out right-wing media? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm cautiously hopeful that it will be a good thing for freedom. Remember, no government has the right to be free from scrutiny. And people have said there's a difference between access and censorship. I think it was actually David Klimenhaga who said that. He said, you know what? You don't get a right to access. The government didn't tell the Rebel we couldn't write about what we wanted. The government just said you couldn't be at certain events. And he was going on about how, well, there are certain events he doesn't get to go to either. When you're talking about government, access is, in effect, denying them the right to have the story. Denying them the right to ask the minister responsible for a certain file what's happening. Denying, in the case of Holly and Sheila, the right to talk to certain stakeholders of another oil event. Denying people the right to review details, instead having to go to secondhand media sources. So yes, there is in fact a level of censorship, or at the very least a fundamental violation of the freedom of the press that is at hand there when the government decides who can and can't be in the room with a minister. Deal with behavior. Don't deal with editorial bent. And here's the thing, I can't remember who tweeted it, but it was actually a mainstream journalist or columnist who tweeted how the government has been there too long to really be allowed to make these level of mistakes and still call them rookie mistakes. We're not dealing with a government that's getting its sea legs here. We're not dealing with an error that was made in the transition. We're dealing with a conscious and cognizant decision made by a government that has clearly a disregard for freedom of the press, a disregard for freedom of speech, and by extension, a disregard for the Constitution of this country. That made a decision, enforced that decision several times, put that decision in writing, in tweets, and then later doubled down and had a government lawyer put in a letter that this decision was in effect. This is not some rookie error. This was deliberate. I'd be very surprised if this did not go up to the Premier herself, given how formalized it seems the ban on the Rebel really was. How formalized, how resolutely Sheila Gunn Reid's and Holly Nicholas's names were apparently on the government blacklist. I wonder if it's actually a physical list. I wonder if it's actually something that is sitting on a desk somewhere in Edmonton. Or if instead it's just something in their minds they know, oh, they're not invited. They're rebels. My goodness, I think Sheila and Holly certainly earned their name, earned their monikers rather, as rebels in this particular case. Who would have thought that standing up for freedom would make one a rebel? But remember, it wasn't on the fundamental grounds that the government embraced freedom of conscience and freedom of press and freedom of speech. That wasn't what made them convert. It was that they were losing favor in the rest of the media's eyes. The government only flipped when the mainstream media started turning on them. Even CBC had a piece which was, admittedly, I thought, favorable towards the Rebels' cause here. A Globe and Mail editorial supportive of the Rebel. An Edmonton Sun column supportive of the Rebel, not supportive of the message. That's never something you want unanimity on anyway, and you're never going to get it from media. Diverse voices, a diverse landscape. The only one who doesn't seem to value that diversity in media is the NDP right now. But they had to. They were forced to because they were losing favor by the people whose support they've been able to count on. And I find it fascinating that even Rabble, the left-wing online publication that some people have called the rebel of the left, even they were very tacit in their approach to this, basically saying, well, you know, it's Ezra and, well, it's Rebel and it's, like Sun News and stuff like that. You guys are the ones that could be banned by the next government, and I would stand up in a heartbeat. I said this to Sheila. If Rabble had ever been censored or denied access as media by Stephen Harper's government, I would be. And people have said that to me, well, would you support a left-wing publication if they were banned by a conservative? I said, absolutely. I don't think it would happen, though. I don't think it would happen, but if it did, I would be the first to stand up in support of them. This is not about left-wing, right-wing. This is about free versus not free. And when that battle happens, which side do you want to stand on? The side of freedom or the side of tyranny? Most Canadians, most journalists were standing on the right side this past week. Not everyone was, but most were. That is a positive. And it's a shame that it took an event like this, which is, by any measure, a very dramatic event, to actually galvanize people to action and prove that there is, in fact, a threat. That the threat of censorship does exist. That people will try to threaten that very freedom. The ones that we, especially in Canada, take for granted. People will still try to challenge it. People will still try to pretend as though the threats don't exist, but they do. And it took the mainstream media calling the government out on its BS for the government to actually realize, hey, maybe we've made a mistake. I'm glad they used that word. I'm glad they at least in some small way owned it instead of blaming a technicality, blaming a low-level staffer, saying, yeah, we didn't know this was happening, having Notley come out and say, look, I don't know how this happened. If Notley really wanted to prove she was serious about this, she could agree to do a sit-down interview with Ms. Gunn Reid herself or with Ezra Levant. I know I would love to, of course, speak to Premier Notley, but I'll leave that for Alberta Bureau. If they want to prove that they are not afraid of being challenged, agree to an interview. Judge based on behavior, not bias. But they know on that there's never going to be a problem. I've got to take a break here. When I come back in just a couple of moments, we'll have more of this podcast, Lawton Online. You're tuned into the Rebel.media, uncensored, unbridled, and of course, defiant in pursuit of the truth. I'm Andrew Lawton. We'll be right back, Canada. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Lawton Online with your host, Andrew Lawton, exclusively on the rebel.media. Email your thoughts to Andrew at andrewlawton.ca or tweet Andrew using @AndrewLawton.
Welcome back to Lawton Online. This is the rebel.media that you are tuned into, and my goodness, this segment is an interesting one. One of the big things that I always try to follow on this show and in general and other work that I do is campus absurdity, campus nonsense. And I don't know why I do it to myself. I didn't like university when I was there because of the cultural attitudes there. I don't know why I immerse myself in it so much now. Maybe it's my selfless gesture to you. I do it so you don't have to. In any case, it often is a microcosm of the real world, but detached from the real world. The reason I follow it is because you really see a concentration of leftist attitudes, and it's where I sort of envision the leftist dystopia existing. If you want to know what would happen if Bernie Sanders wins the presidency, well, just look at stuff that happens on university and college campuses. One really startling reality of that discussion, though, is the level of anti-Semitism and more broadly anti-Zionism that exists on campuses. And we see this in a number of different ways. Boycott, divestment, sanctions, the BDS movement, is perhaps the most telling reality of this. Now, BDS is not new. It's been around for, I believe, about a decade in a formal named sense. But it still is growing in terms of the approaches and attitudes we see of people trying to bring others around to it, mostly on campuses. Because that's the only area where you seem to be able to unilaterally make sweeping generalizations about Israel and have them actually be received instead of, challenged or questioned or critically analyzed. The latest example of that is McGill University, which unfortunately has fallen victim to the mob, which is ultimately the group that most heavily advocates for BDS, which is basically an economic blacklisting of any company that has an Israeli connection. And by the way, if a lot of these people knew how many things they use on a regular basis were Israeli invented, they'd probably find themselves without, a cell phone, for example. Now, I went to Israel in November, and it was my second visit there. And I've got to tell you, BDS is something that is known there, but it doesn't really play a huge role in day-to-day life for Israelis. Israelis do their own thing. Israelis aren't trying to be liked by everyone in the world. They're trying to survive. They're trying to exist. They're trying to offer a safe place for the world's Jews, and they're trying to stay safe from Palestinian terrorists that keep trying to kill Jews. They're less concerned with what brand of hummus you can get on a campus in North America than they are with whether or not they're going to be alive tomorrow to buy hummus. So let's put some context in here. People aren't even really fighting Israel in a way that Israel cares about that much when they talk about BDS. But it's about the PR battle, which I think is very important for Israel. Now, Barbara Kay, who was actually on the podcast, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, she wrote about this McGill case, and it's not new there. It's the third time in 2 years and the fifth time in 2 years, fifth time in 7 years that these crusaders are on what she calls a warpath. But There's a motion for the Student Society of McGill on February 22nd to support any BDS campaigns on campus, and I'm quoting here, and to pressure the McGill Board of Governors to divest from corporations complicit in the occupation of the Palestinian territories, unquote. They've had similar motions in the past, but still it keeps coming back. There's enough of a movement on campus that clearly this is the issue they want to keep bringing up. And if you look at the groups that are spearheading this, McGill Black Students Network, McGill Students for Feminism, the McGill Syrian Students Association, the Union for Gender Empowerment. These are the groups that are leading the charge here. They aren't even connected to Middle Eastern issues. There was a great column I read in January by Adam Milstein, and he wrote that BDS doesn't just threaten Israel, but BDS actually threatens everyone. He was writing about this issue from an American perspective, from an American context, but when I read through it, it really was easily extrapolated to a Canadian one. BDS isn't a war against Israel, it's a war against all of us. It threatens all of us, he was saying. I'm very pleased to welcome Adam Milstein to the program now, National Chairman of the Israeli-American Council. Adam, it's great to have you on the show. I really appreciate your time today on this issue.
Thank you, Andrew. It's my pleasure.
We've heard a lot of discussion for years now about BDS. We've heard it mostly on campuses. That seems to be the area where it's gaining more traction than anywhere else. Let's talk first off, for people that aren't as familiar with the concept here, this is not about sensible, respectful debate, is it? This is about something much more dark than that.
Absolutely. BDS started on campus about 10 years ago in 2005. And it's very active on the universities because it's very, I think, fertile ground for them. There is a lot of anti-Israel professors and administrators, so the students have a lot of support to run their campaign. But today, it's going outside of the universities. It's moving behind the campus. It's moving into churches and unions and municipalities. So after they gain a lot of experience and momentum on campus, they are taking the campaign outside to minority groups in the United States, to union, churches, you name it.
I mentioned just at the top of the segment here, before I brought you on, we're seeing this now at another Canadian university, McGill University, which is a very respected institution, has a movement that its student organization will be debating next week as to whether or not to support BDS, and they've brought together a lot of other groups here. I mean, they've brought together a feminist group, a black students group, other human rights groups, environmental groups, groups that have nothing to do with Middle Eastern geopolitical interactions that somehow feel that they are the authorities on this. Why is it just such a catch-all now? I mean, all of these other groups seem to be jumping onto this campaign, even when they have nothing to do with the actual issues at stake in the Middle East right now.
Right. Let's look a little bit about the history of the BDS to understand why it is so successful today on campus. So the BDS is really another transformation of the Arab League boycott that started in the early 1900s, in 1922, against Israel. It wasn't really successful on the campus until some 10 years ago, when somehow a unity became between the radical left students and professors and the radical Muslims. And both of them, both the radical Muslims and the radical left, as issues with the State of Israel. For radical Islam, it's the first front in their campaign to take over Europe and North America. I mean, the radical Muslims are saying Israel is the small Satan, but America is the big Satan. The radical left have not been part of the campaign, which explain why it was never on the universities, but they joined the campaign around 2005. And the radical left had figured out that their hatred to our way of life, to our capitalism system, to our colonialism, to our Judeo-Christian values, there was no way for them to stand up and fight against those issues here in America, because this is what makes us American. So they all picked up a small Jewish state in the Middle East, name Israel, that is a proxy of America, because if you look at Israel, it's a democracy, it's a prospering democracy, prospering technology, human right to everyone, freedom of religion. So they picked up on Israel, and Israel is now the Satan of the world. But in essence, this group is anti-American. It's anti our way of life. It's anti our Judeo-Christian values. But it's easy for them to pick up on the Jews, because the Jews are always, first of all, they're not united. As you know, Jews are never united. There is anti-Semitism every place, and it's very easy to pick up on the Jews. Very few people will come up to protect the Jews. So now we have kind of a very strange coalition between radical left that have been very active on campus for generations, and they know how to run political campaigns and human rights campaigns, and radical Muslims. And they united together in their hate to the Jews in Israel. And once the radical left got involved, they have taught the radical Muslims how to use human rights campaign, branding campaign to promote the BDS as actually a human rights issue, as a campaign against oppression, colonialism, and basically they brought together a lot of their way of campaigning in the past, building coalition, branding, and bringing many, many groups and issues together. The Palestinians, believe it or not, are now champion of immigration laws. They're champion of Black Lives Matter. They're champion of every other minority issue, so that when it comes to discuss BDS on campus, suddenly you see everybody in campus, all the minority group, all the human rights groups, everybody is part of their coalition. They have a code word that works for everybody. They come to the Armenian and say, Armenians, you suffer genocide. We suffer genocide. They forget to mention to the Armenian who exactly committed the genocide. But the Armenian is part of the coalition. They come to the African Americans and tell them, you suffered discrimination. Africans suffered discrimination in South Africa, apartheid. So we are suffering apartheid in Israel. Be with us. And the African Americans say, well, that makes a lot of sense. This code word called apartheid is exactly what moves us, was make us an activist. We will be happy to be with you. You mentioned the Syrians. The Syrians are against Israel. 550,000 people got killed or injured in the last 5 years. This is now World War III, because you got like 5 or 6 armies involved in the killing in Syria. And the Syrian students, instead of being concerned about Syria, they're concerned about the Palestinian issue. It's absurd how they're able to connect to everybody, bring everybody, and really rally everybody for their causes.
And a lot of those groups that you've just mentioned that make up this coalition in the radical left are, quite oddly enough, groups that would only enjoy protections in Israel if they were in the Middle East, like, for example, gay groups, like women's groups, like a lot of ethnic minorities. You mentioned Israel's status as the only democracy. These groups wouldn't even be welcomed in the territory that they're claiming is suffering apartheid right now.
You're absolutely right. All those groups that are uniting right now in a coalition with the BDS promoters, they all really enjoy the freedom and the rights only in Israel. But, sadly enough, it's hard to take this argument to the gay and lesbian or to the Christians and get them to unite with the Jews. It's just some reason they tend to believe to the narrative of the Palestinians. Even the gay lesbian group tend to believe the Palestinians. When we come to them, and as you just said, we say, listen, there is no gay and no gay rights in Palestine, or as a matter of fact, in the Arab world. Well, they just wave us off. It doesn't matter. You still stole the land from the Palestinians. You still commit genocide and ethnic cleansing. So it doesn't work for us. That's why the subject of my article was the BDS is not against Israel. It's against all of us. People need to wake up and understand BDS is about Israel today, but about Europe, America, and all our Western civilization tomorrow. And I've indicated to you, the Israeli people, instead of Israel, are the small Satan for all those groups. America is the enemy. America is the target, and people need to wake up. And if they do, I believe we can fight together stronger and win. If it's only an issue of the Israelis have to fight or Jews have to fight, we are doomed.
Do you think that BDS is inherently anti-Semitic?
Well, the question is what is anti-Semitic? The Arabs are also Semitic, and many people in the radical left are actually Jews. So when we go into anti-Jewish, if you ask, is it anti-Jewish? Absolutely. And I tell you why. If the only people in the world that are being discriminated against by the BDS are Jews, the only country in the world that all the boycotts are being applied to is the Jewish state, it's clearly an anti-Jewish campaign. But I explained to you why they're picking on the Jews first. It's easy, it's popular, and they're gaining momentum and allies, and they're going to move into their bigger targets, which is America. You can see already some terrorist activity taking place in America. And while you might say, well, what's the connection to the campus? Well, this is the radical Islam ideology that is really getting foothold in our campuses. Did you know that in a UC system in Merced, it was in November, a Muslim student that had an ISIS flag in his pocket, he was not invited to a study group with 5 girls and none of them was Jews. And he pulled up a knife and he stopped 5 students for not including him in the study group.
Wow.
So you won't read about it in the American media because again, it's a domestic dispute, right? It's like 4-2. Everything is domestic. Everything is not connected to anything. But we have more and more radical Islam attacks in the United States on campus and beyond.
What is the antidote to this in terms of discussion? You've talked about the fact that the media is not reporting it. You've talked about the fact that when you engage with these groups, they don't want to talk about the facts. How will BDS be defeated in your eyes? Well,
I think we have to continue what the Jewish community in U.S. and Canada is doing, which is to educate, to train our activists, to take many, many missions to Israel, to let the students and the young people see it for their own eyes. We have to continue all that. We need to build coalitions with not the advocates for the BDS, but the followers, the thing that they feel for the pain and suffering of the Palestinian people. So we need to outreach, we need to build, we need to educate. But I think we need also to think about to complement all that with things that we didn't do until today. I would say more kind of offensive. See exactly who's funding those groups, who are those groups, who is behind the groups, who's running the show, how money from the Middle East come and funds all those activities here, how they operate. The fact that they're not just anti-Jews, they're anti-Americans, anti-Canada, anti-U.S. We need to expand our campaign and complement it with the new activities outside of the box. I would say transform or expand our defense also to include offense.
Joining me on the line is Adam Milstein, National Chairman of the Israeli-American Council. A brilliant piece you wrote and absolutely wonderfully illuminating comments you've made on this program, Adam. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
My pleasure, Andrew. Take care.
Adam has written a number of pieces of similar nature on this issue before on Huffington Post, and what's interesting is the level of negative backlash he gets for standing up for Israel. What astonishes me, it doesn't astonish me, I should probably choose a word a little bit better than that. What scares me is the level of ignorance that so many people have on the issue of Israel who pontificate the most on that very issue. People that call Israel oppressors, that use that buzzword that Adam mentioned a few moments ago of being an apartheid state. People that have no understanding of history and, more importantly, no understanding of the place that anti-Semitism has in the world today. I'm not a Jew. I'm a Gentile. I don't have skin in this game except for to say that I'm an observer. And I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. And I don't know how, when one's eyes are open, you can be anything but supportive of Israel's right to exist. When you have two people, two entities here, the Israeli government, the Israeli state, and the Palestinian people. Sure, a lot of people in the Palestinian territories. A lot of the Palestinians want peace, but so many don't. You know, I spoke about this when I got back from Israel. I interviewed Maher Shalaby, an Israeli, there's a Freudian slip if ever there was one, a Palestinian television host. He hosts a show that translates to Transparent. He lives in Ramallah, the capital of the Palestinian Authority. And my group met with him when we were in Israel, which is great. I mean, the organizers of the trip, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, wanted us to have a balanced perspective. They wanted us to hear from Palestinian voices as well. And I wrote a column in the Toronto Sun about this when I got back. He does what I do. He's a talk show host in Palestine. And he told me about a topic he had done on his show the week before, or the week that we were there. It was very close in time. And that was back in November, around the time that there had been a series of knife stabbings of Israelis, of Jews, on the streets of Israel by Palestinians. And he said that he did a segment on this. Is it okay to stab Jews in the street? That was the question he asked his listeners. Now, I take callers on my radio show on AM 980 in London, Ontario. I let people call in, and I ask questions. I can assure you that's never one that I would ask, because I would assume, why ask a question when you know what everyone's going to say? Everyone's going to say, of course not. That's stupid. Put a real show on the air. But his show in Ramallah, he asked that question, is it okay to stab Jews in the street? And this is what he said. Most said no. Most, not all. It's popular enough to kill Jews that you have people that are calling in and saying, well, okay, no, I wouldn't do it, but if someone else did, sure. That's even a question. That is the reality of life for Palestinians right now, is that they're talking about with their friends. So, do you think it's okay to stab Jews? Tom says yes, you say no, Ahmed says yes, Mahmoud says no. Whereas in Israel, they're getting up in the morning and saying, wow, I hope I don't get stabbed today, because I know there are a bunch of people 10 kilometers from here. Heck, a bunch of people that even live on this side of the boundary, on this side of the border, who are saying, you know what, I think it actually is okay. I'm going to call into a talk radio show because I think it's okay to kill Jews. This is why, as I said before, Israelis are less concerned with whether or not you can get Sabra hummus on a university campus than they are with trying to stay alive. But this is for the people who are fighting those campus battles. You need to ask yourself, do you honestly think that when Israel is fighting this, Israel is fighting for survival? When the Jews, for the first time in history, have as close as possible to a safe place to be in the world, do you honestly think that that statehood should be obliterated because of the people that think it's okay to kill them in the streets, to stab them? That the government, if you can even call it that, of Gaza, doesn't want a two-state solution. They don't want peaceful coexistence with Israel, like, by the way, Israel has said it wants and would accept. But no, instead, they want nothing but the obliteration of Israel. The obliteration of the Jewish people. This is a part of the Hamas charter. And then we have Hamas, which is funding the Muslim Brotherhood, which funds, in turn, organizations in Canada. Mosques, Muslim advocacy groups, student programs. We're not dealing with just an ideological battle here. We're dealing with something that does cut very close, and in some cases is exactly the same as terrorist funding in domestic situations for Canadians. And this is why it is important to fight BDS. Because BDS is the face of anti-Zionism, which is rooted for so many people in anti-Semitism. Critical dissent or critical disagreement with Israeli decisions, that's not only acceptable, but that should be encouraged. Critical debate of any issue should be encouraged. But when you know the facts, denying the Jewish people a right to have a state with all that they've experienced is misguided at best, anti-Semitic at worst. And we've seen what happens when that level of anti-Semitism becomes embraced on a mass scale. We only have to look 70 years ago to see that. So why should we accept and support states or organizations and entities or territories that want to be states that have a similar goal and a similar view of the Jewish people? How is that anything that we should find acceptable? So grateful that Adam Milstein is a voice of reason on this. And so grateful Barbara Kay is a voice of reason on this. Her piece in the National Post fighting BDS once again gained a lot of traction. Hopefully they will defeat it once again. That's coming up next week on February 22nd. I've got to take a break here. When we come back, we'll have a final wrap-up of this program. You're tuned into Lawton Online here on the rebel.media. Stay tuned.
He's unapologetic, unwavering, and unafraid to take on the left's sacred cows. He's Andrew Lawton, and you're listening to Lawton Online on the rebel.media.
We are back. This is Lawton Online here on the rebel.media. I don't often do this, but I wanted to revisit, at least in some small way here, a topic I did on the show last time. It was an interview with the president of the Canadian Federation of Students, Bilan Art, about whether education should be free and universal. Now, obviously, the CFS, a student union, is not grounded in a reality of economics. The guest in question was advocating for something that I just think is fundamentally a bad idea, and I told her as much. The feedback from that interview has been really entertaining. People have basically said listening to her made them want to pull out their hair. People have said hopefully she doesn't get a law degree and start practicing law. Look, she's had her judgment clouded by the institutions that she is aiming for people to have access to for free. But even though the response to that has been overwhelmingly positive in terms of actually the segment, I got an email and a comment. They might have been from the same person, I don't know, on the Rebel website saying, as for that woman, debate her as opposed to rebutting her after she gets off the phone. Well, first off, I did debate her. I did challenge her. I did say, look, why is it important? Why is this a necessity? Why should we be encouraging it? I asked her about youth unemployment. Look, just because people don't like her answers or don't like the questions even doesn't mean I didn't actually challenge them. The rebuttal after the fact is more that, you only have a certain amount of time with a person, and then after the fact, you really have to delve into what those values really represent. So I don't make any apologies for the interview nor that particular style of interview. What I find interesting has been that a few people have emailed me and said basically what I thought, which is I didn't want to hear that, but I'm glad I know that attitude exists. And I think that's a really important point to note here because so many of us have this ability or this tendency, and I'm guilty of it myself in some way or have been in the past, to forget that not everyone thinks like us. And sometimes that's to our detriment. Because sometimes I'll look at a situation and think, oh, wow, that's great. It's going to be handled like this. And then it doesn't. And I'm like, oh, I forget. Not everyone's as smart as I am. I say that only partially in jest. But you know what? I think some governments have lowered the bar substantially on intelligence. It doesn't take much to rise above it. But this idea of universality has been one of the biggest myths that the left has really tried to advance here. What Ms. Art was advocating for last week on the show is universality in post-secondary education. But the fact of the matter is we also see people advocating in a similar fashion for universality in Medicare. For example, in the U.S., in Canada, well, we've seen how badly that turns out. Universality for drug coverage, for pharmaceuticals. Once Trudeau legalizes marijuana, I'm sure there are going to be people talking about universal pot coverage as well. We have people advocating for a universal guaranteed annual income. One of the biggest disincentives to working that a country could embrace is on the table now. People want universal. And this is all part and parcel of this very dangerous economically and culturally attitude of everyone has to be equal. The funny thing is equality isn't even really a worthwhile goal anymore. I remember seeing this cartoon a while ago circulating online, and I realized that's a very dangerous place to try to find sensible debate at some point. But it was this meme, they call it. And I saw people sharing it, and it was just so infuriating. It's about 3 kids who are trying to watch a baseball game. And one of them is really tall, one of them is medium height, and one of them is really, really short. And there are 3 wooden crates. Everyone has a wooden crate. The tall person standing on one crate, the medium person standing on one crate, the kid standing on one crate. Well, the short kid can't see over the fence to watch the baseball game. But they all have one crate. They've all been given an equal shot at things. And then there's another frame where the tall person standing on the ground and can see over the fence, the medium person is standing on one crate, can see over the fence, and the short person standing on two crates and can see over the fence. And it says equality doesn't mean justice. Now, let's dispense with the notion, first off, that people should be encouraged to watch a sporting event without actually having purchased a ticket. But it's this idea that equality is never enough. You can give someone an opportunity, but ultimately it's that old saying, you can lead a horse to water, you can't make him drink. And herein lies the biggest problem of the left, is that the left wants to claim that it's all about equality and fairness, but then it becomes about justice. Then it becomes about relativism. Then it becomes about affirmative action. The fact is, by the virtue of being a Canadian, you're born with equality. You're born with the ability to seek a future for yourself. You're born with the ability to decide for yourself what you want to do. You're given freedom. Notwithstanding the issues we had in Alberta that we talked about earlier on in the show with freedom of the press. You're born with a freedom to do what works for you. People rise above so much adversity in their lives. But the left wants to hand feed everyone. The left wants to coddle everyone. The left wants people to be able to be given something rather than to earn it. And there was this stupid cartoon that was showed at a school in the U.S. last week or the week before, and I know there was a scene-by-scene breakdown of it on The Rebel this week, actually. A cartoon talking about, or sharing, I guess, the visual of four people in a race. A white man, a white woman, and then two minorities. And the race is the same length, but you're running through, and it talks about all the hurdles that the white students don't have to deal with. Discrimination. Racism, bigotry, prejudices, all these different things that seem to get in the way of the racers, except for the white racers. And then when they get to the tail end, of course, the white man comes in first, the white woman comes in second, the minorities don't even finish, because this is the world we're told we live in right now, where only whites have a shot. Anyone else, sorry guys, too many obstacles in your path. You need the government to help you. You need the state to help you. You need equity programming, diversity program, all these sorts of things. Really, really offensive and quite belittling to people in those groups. In fact, some of the most virulent critics of affirmative action that I've ever encountered have been minorities who want to be seen as something more than just the race that they are. And in my eyes to the left, they're tokens. To the left, they're simply demographics, checkboxes on a diversity questionnaire. I've got to take a break for 7 days here. I know our time has sadly come to an end, but thank you for all the feedback you've gotten. I'm curious what you think about anything. My email address is andrew@andrewlawton.ca. And, of course, I look forward to chatting with you next Thursday at therebel.media. Thanks so much for listening, Canada. We'll talk to you soon. God bless you.
Thanks for tuning in to Lawton Online. Check out the rebel.media for lots more fearless content and commentary.